The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anush Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Welcome back. Hope you're all well. Feels a long time ago now since I was on my Australia trip, and real life is very much settled back in. But we have a new puppy which has turned our world upside down, so you might hear him in the background. We keep trucking along here in the cannabis world though, and I've got a great episode today covering some of what's happening in Europe as well as North America and what the future holds. As ever, the show is sponsored by my lovely friends at Lumino. We are talking about cannabis investment today, and Lumino work very closely with investors by protecting their investments with the best-in-class talent to give their investments the best chance to succeed. They also help connect good companies with investors as they got a great overview of the market and how companies work beneath the PR, a very useful perspective for investors when putting their money into a company. So as always, if you need any help with HR or recruitment, do get in touch with them at luminorecruit.com. And obviously, please mention my name when you do. Oh, I also forgot to mention, there is a patient conference by Drug Science that's happening in November, which I will be co-hosting. And I put details of that on LinkedIn. Please do come along. It'll be a very interesting day, full of great speakers and really being able to hear the perspectives of patients who are trying to get access to medical cannabis. Now, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, we have Will Muecke, who is co-founder and managing partner of Artemis Growth Partners. Artemis Growth are a cannabis VC fund with over $350 million under management. We also have Daniel Grözinger, who is from Park Lane Capital. They are a German M&A boutique with a focus on growth companies. Gents, welcome. How are you today?
Doing well. Thank you, Anush.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, pleasure. And good to see you again, Will. So, Will, you've been on the show before a couple of times, I think, but we usually like to start with a bit of background on both of you guys. And maybe Daniel as kind of the new guy. Would you mind introducing yourself first and tell us a bit about what you were doing before and how you came to be involved in the cannabis space?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So thanks for giving me the time to introduce myself. So I'm Daniel. I'm a partner at a M&A boutique. I'm doing this job for over 10 years now. I have a little bit of an unusual background for an M&A banker or investment banker. So I used to be a founder. I founded companies back in 99 after I finished my studies. I started right away with an online ticketing company. It's comparable to Ticketmaster, and it was a totally different time. It had nothing to do with cannabis. So it was kind of the first steps into my professional career. It was pretty successful. We later sold it to Eventim. That's the second largest ticketing company today in the world. And then I started an online marketing agency, a gaming company, a company that is doing, it's like online comparable to Ancestry. It's a company that we later sold to MyHeritage. So I had quite a few experiences as a founder. And 10 years ago, I changed a little bit sides and became an investment banker, partner at the M&A boutique. And what I've done before, like building companies and then selling them, now help other founders to sell their companies. Our core focus is on digital growth companies. And since the cannabis industry is new, for the first years, I've had nothing to do with cannabis. But a few years back, I was with the regulatory changes in Germany. I got more and more interested in this segment in this market. And then luckily, we met a very, very cool team 2.5 years ago. That's the team of 420 Pharma. And we helped them to do actually a very good deal with Curaleaf. And in this process, I also met Will, and we came along very well. And it's always a pleasure to exchange ideas with Will and his team. And I think we come back to that one. So that's basically what I do today. I help founders to sell their company or to raise capital, so all the things an M&A banker is doing.
Brilliant. And Germany's where it's all happening in Europe. So a great place to be. Thank you for that, Daniel. Will, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'll first comment on Daniel's introduction, which I think is being very humble, because when we met Daniel and team at Park Lane, they were advising 420 on raising capital prior to the sale to Cureleaf. So we got very involved in the process, got to know the team. What ultimately was structured as the transaction that allowed Cureleaf to buy a controlling interest in 420 and bring that team into Cureleaf. It was disappointing for Artemis because we wanted to put money into the company and continue to grow the business. But it turned out to be, I think, one of the best structured cannabis deals. It was a win-win for both companies. It wasn't a crazy price that Cureleaf paid. They got great assets, but a really great team. And on the back end, the founders preserved the upside of the transaction. So I thought that was a very astute way of structuring a deal. And again, as we were disappointed to lose the deal to a buyer, by no means were we upset with the way that it turned out for the founders and the team. And so I think it's been a great thing for cannabis. Hopefully, future deals will be as well constructed and thoughtfully brought together. So hats off to the Park Lane team for being able to arrange that. But as far as our background, I'll step one step back. We started investing in cannabis in 2018. We formed the fund really in 2017. We started with $5 million in capital, sort of friends and family rounds, and have built up an asset base. As you say, I think we were at 392 or almost $400 million as of the second quarter last year for assets under management. We only invest in cannabis. Our backgrounds are all from the financial services industry. I was managing director and global co-head of healthcare services investment banking at Goldman for many years before leaving to start investing in the private equity fund. A 30-year track record at finance, 15 of that as an investment banker and 15 as a principal. Our team is constructed of the same sort of background. So we operate as whether, you pick JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Mesoamerica, the backgrounds of the three partners at Artemis. We approach cannabis as we would any other private equity industry for growth stage capital, venture capital. We do diligence. We spend time canvassing the space and understanding where the strategic opportunities are. And then we build a portfolio that hopefully has alpha within the portfolio to make positive returns. So we have a networking effect. And we've been relatively successful so far. Our focus right now is really on Europe. So this is a germane conversation because while we started investing in the US back in 2018 and then went into Latin America, the Caribbean, and then eventually we had a first asset that we invested in late 2018, early 2019, which was in Denmark. That's Valcon Medical. Where we've seen sort of the tables turning in the last couple of years is the US still somewhat moribund with regulatory hangups, while Europe, although sort of steadfast and very process-oriented, maybe a slower approach to cannabis regulation, liberalization. The regulatory environment is changing in Europe. It is going to be a very unique opportunity, generational type of opportunity for wealth creation. And we find that when you aggregate all of the European countries, and you're talking about a population of 750 million people, the demographic profile is incredibly powerful to say that Europe is really on the rise for cannabis opportunities. So we're spending most of our time now focused on the European theater. We still have our assets in the US that we continue to support. But as far as new growth opportunities in the near term, we think that Germany is the epicenter of what's happening right now.
Yeah, that's very encouraging to hear. It's obviously quite a complex picture, on both sides of the pond, which we'll go into a bit more in detail in a minute. But sort of, I guess between you guys, you will have kicked the tires on most businesses in this space in Europe that are looking for capital, or most decent ones, I would hope. If you can share maybe a couple of the investments that or the companies that you've backed, just to give us an idea, that would be nice.
Sure. So for us in Europe, we started, as I said, with Valcon Medical, which is a formulation and EU GMP certified, effectively a pharmaceutical API extraction business. That now has strategic investment from non-cannabis investors in the pharma and tobacco area for developing products both to be harm reduction in tobacco and then to be health and wellness oriented on the pharma side. That's a great company, a great territory. Denmark, while it's a small market demographically, only 5 million people in Denmark, it was one of the first countries to codify the medical cannabis program for producers and manufacturers and really set the stage for future growth. So we love that business. We also invested in a company called Soteria Holdings that started as a CBD play in the UK, and it actually has, through FSA, several SKUs that they can put on the shelves in the stores. But we kind of stepped away from the CBD side and focused more on the medical opportunity. The founder is a very dynamic person, a Czech background, speaks English, Czech, German, and Polish, and discovered probably 24 months ago that Poland was really opening up as an opportunity. And so we started a subsidiary of the holding company in Poland for medical cannabis. And now I think it's the number one prescribing entity in Poland and is bringing in a product from folks like 420 to satisfy the growing Poland cannabis market, which I think is going to be a very, very interesting market. We also invested in a company called Rainbow, which is a CBD play that's now morphing into a THC play as France opens up its potential state-sponsored cannabis program. And we do see France as an illicit market, as a very large cannabis consuming country. So again, I think that cannabis is one of the most easy theses in the world, which is just a flip from the illicit market to the regulated and legal market. We think France is going to be very interesting and very big. So we've been following the Rainbow team and supporting them in their efforts. And then in Germany, we invested, it was really structured at the end of last year, but invested early this year into Bloomwell Group, which is kind of the big brother to our Polish company. It again is the number one prescribing business in Germany. It also has a subsidiary vertical that does sort of post-harvest manufacturing, importation, and wholesale. And then it has a tech platform where dispensaries, I should say pharmacies in Germany, can plug into their tech play and be the retail distribution arm of the cannabis product that's coming into the country. And we think that Bloomwell is actually a great platform, not only for Germany, but for Europe as it rolls out, to really rinse and repeat country to country. And we think that that's going to be a very interesting play on an asset-light basis. So those have been mainly our stakes, looking at country dynamics, demographics, underlying demographics, patient subscriber or patient role trends, and then looking for the best teams in the space that we think can not only operate today, but maybe pivot for how the markets change tomorrow and be dynamic and responsive to those changes.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Will. And a good geographic spread as well. Daniel?
Yeah, that's a very good example, what Will just explained, of a very thoughtful approach into investing in the cannabis market. I think when new markets kind of rise, like the cannabis market in the last 5 years, you sometimes have the trend or the situation where a lot of money goes into the market and some decisions are taken, in my view, a little bit too quick. And I think it's very important, if you want to be a successful investor in the long run and also in a successful industry in the long run, it's very important that you actually think about what's the business model of the company, what's the long-term strategic approach of the company. Can you really create value over time and not just build up a valuation short term? And I think you've seen a lot of those companies. It's not unique for cannabis. You can see that also in other markets when something like really big happens and a new market kind of is developing. But I really like the Artemis approach and portfolio. There are also other interesting companies out there, but the companies they chose are very good. And I think part of our discussion today will be about what are the characteristics of a successful company, what's actually happening in cannabis, what will be successful in the long run. And I'm very confident that quite a few of the companies of Artemis will be very successful. So it's a very good approach, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, that's quite a good segue. Let's move to the kind of broad topic of what's happening in Europe and get a bit of your idea. And Daniel, obviously, Germany will be a kind of particular area for you in terms of types of businesses. So we can talk about that. And then let's expand it a bit further beyond these shores and look at the US, I suppose, or North America. But yeah, let's start with Germany. That's a good place to start. So obviously there were some quite grand plans that came out from the coalition government, and reality has set in, as well as the obligations that are upon Germany as part of the EU and other international agreements. They've kind of released more scaled back plans now. Where are we with these, and what are some of the features of the new model?
So I think you're very right on the broad-based unfortunate disappointment with how things have rolled out, because I've said this on stage before. If you take away the headlines and take away kind of the news drag and the narrative over the last year or so, and you just look at the regulatory environment that Germany will have in place by the end of this year, really going into next, it's actually a pretty incredible new world for cannabis, because the German model, and we'll talk about sort of pillar 1 and pillar 2, the German model first and foremost is going to reschedule cannabis from a narcotic to a non-narcotic. That should take place perhaps even as soon as the first quarter of 24. But that change alone is going to have a dramatic influence on the size of the market. Right now in Germany, you have to go through a specialist It's not the easiest thing to find a specialist. Doctors are somewhat reticent because of the legal complications that cannabis could potentially bring to their own careers, with it being a narcotic status right now. And so the process today is a little bit cumbersome to get involved if you're a patient that's looking to have a legal script. And there are plenty of patients that are both, taking advantage of what currently is available today, which is near full reimbursement for your cannabis products. But there's also a widespread group of patients that are really sort of historically folks that have been self-medicating in the illicit market and are now coming to the legal market because the price of cannabis in Germany on the legal side is actually at or sometimes even below what the illicit market can provide. And it's a safe product that has a COA, certificate of authentication, that allows you to see what the cannabis has in it as far as cannabinoid profile and make sure that it's clean, no pesticides, no heavy metals, etc. So there's a very large waiting private pay market that's out there. When you look at Pillar 1, which is, first of all, decriminalizing cannabis on a personal level and allowing people to have up to 3 plants themselves, there's a lot of complication around what that actually will look like in practice. And I was at a conference last weekend that I spoke at where people were talking about the problems that come with the new regulations. You can't use cannabis within certain numbers of meters of a school or of an other local jurisdiction, and trying to enforce that becomes very complicated. They were kind of joking, or police can be walking around with meter sticks trying to figure out how far away you are from a certain location. That being said, the opportunity of citizens having cannabis in their possession up to a certain amount legally is a change in Germany that has been sort of long awaited. And when you look through that and you talk about the patient population that wants to have legal access, having GPs now able to write scripts under the new regime, you're looking at a potential 3 to 5-fold increase in the patient roll almost overnight. The encumbrances are going to be taken away. The legal risk for a prescriber, for a doctor, is going to go away. And the acceptance of cannabis, we've already seen the data coming out on efficacy, whether it's for neurological pain, PTSD, sleep, or otherwise. We see those categories just opening up into the private pay market in a significant way. So under Pillar 1, I think the opportunity is going to be very significant for those players that already have EU GMP product or in the EU GMP certified supply chain that's going to be addressing what we think could be a market that's now, today, patient roll in Germany is between kind of 200 and 250,000 patients. We can see that easily doubling, trebling, going up 4 or 5 times. It's not a big stretch of the imagination to say that you could see 1 million subscribers on the patient roll, given that the illicit market in Germany today is at least 4 million, non-legal users of cannabis that are effectively self-medicating. So the first piece is going to be very interesting. The second piece, which is Pillar 2, and talking about rolling out what will be sort of the future of potential adult use, I think that's where there's been a lot of hand-wringing. I think that the original expectation, or at least some of what had been intuited from the promise of what the new cannabis regulations would deliver, I think folks were thinking this was going to be more like a California type of market where you're going to have every product under the sun. You're going to have safe and legal access for anyone who's 21 and up. And it's just not that. I think that the legal constraints internationally with the UN Single Convention really prevent the transport of cannabis as a recreational product. And so along those lines, Germany, I don't think, was willing to go through a sort of full legalization that would go in the face of international law. However, what they're doing on the retail side and on the full rec side is taking a scientific approach, much like what's happening in the Netherlands or in Switzerland, where they're having a period of time where they're erecting and allowing for legal access in certain nodes in certain cities. And it will be that you can walk in without a prescription and buy cannabis and walk out of the dispensary or out of the pharmacy. But it is seen as a legal scientific data program. So they're going to be gathering data for a certain period of time, collect that data, review that data before anything happens. So we're not going to see a California recreational program in Germany anytime soon. I think this is going to be sort of 3-4 years out that we may see the data coming in and then change happening. However, what we do see is an increase in the demand side as far as legal patients coming into the marketplace. We also see an expansion of the products. We have basically flower and oral concentrate right now available in Germany. But with compounding pharmacies, you can now see the future where a battery and a cartridge being filled by a pharmacist for a vape is effectively medical device in Germany, and that will be a legal market. So we'll see probably a third category of vape opening up fairly quickly, just because it's easier for dosing, for patient convenience. I think that doctors would rather prescribe a vape than flower, a non-combustible substance rather than a combustible substance. So I think the German market is actually a really interesting market. And again, despite the hand-wringing around people that said that it's not delivering what people had hoped for, I think it's delivering a very significant portion of what had been promised. And for investors like ourselves, we see this as almost nirvana. This is going to be the largest full legal market where product can flow in and out of that market on an importation-exportation basis. And we just see that it could be a cornerstone for the rest of Europe opening up, which I think would be very interesting.
Absolutely. There's loads, and I'll come to you in a second, Daniel, but there's loads there. Some of the practicalities that you talked about are, I think these are certainly some learnings can be had from certain US states in terms of zoning and all of this stuff that I guess they will learn through rolling it out and making some mistakes. So hopefully they can learn from some mistakes from the US. But it's really interesting. I think the most interesting point is the focus on medical as seeing a boost to that, because all of the chat has been about recreational. And I think it was slightly misguided to come out and have such bold statements, because now it feels like things are being pulled back when actually, as you say, the reality is it's a significant progression. And so, there's loads of great stuff there. And just the kind of acceptance within society that this will bring will be huge. And Germany, being the biggest market in Europe in many respects, not just cannabis, I think provides the opportunity to have a really good template, if you like, or at least a kind of, a really good model to follow for the rest of Europe. So I'm very positive and hopeful for this. Daniel, with all of that being said, and in terms of what you do, what are you seeing in terms of the types of company that might succeed in this future market?
So I think it was a very good explanation from Will, what's actually happening at the moment, and that you kind of have to take the buzz out a little bit from looking on the changes. And I share his view that these changes are very, very big step forward, not the step some have hoped for. And if something happens not as someone has hoped for, there's always a little bit disappointment. From an M&A perspective, I would say that for some companies, this step is very, very, very good. So if you are a company that can handle cannabis, that has a solid business model that can handle, you still have a lot of regulatory things in this market. So if you're experienced in this field, like the company we sold with 420, or also some of the investments of Will, I think for them it's a very good step forward. And the market is getting a lot bigger, and it will make it easier to raise additional capital. Maybe not on the same valuation they were hoping for, because some valuations were actually driven by the expectation that the whole market is opening up and recreational, everything will be there. And for some companies, I have to say, unfortunately, that they will have a very, very hard time, and probably many of them will not succeed in raising capital at the same valuation. And some probably, that's again, then the second step, bringing up other problems. If you can't raise at the same valuation, it's always complicated to do a down round, and that has a lot of complications. So it will raise problems for some of the companies. But if you have a solid shareholder base and a good business model, I think it's a big step forward. But it will take out also the buzz from the M&A, like kind of from the valuation perspective of companies. So in a market that is simply smaller, when you only have 1 million patients and not 4 or 5 or 6, it takes a little bit longer to build huge companies. Valuations will be lower. And so I look at from two sides. Good, solid companies will have more, you can make better plans. There's more certainty what's going to happen. That makes it a lot easier, from my perspective, to raise capital. And from the other point of view, it's for some of the companies not a good news, because they already raised capital in the past on the expectation that the whole market will open up, and that's simply not happening. And I think there will be companies going out of the business, and that's unfortunate. But if you look on the whole industry or the whole society, it's unfortunate for the company, but overall, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think very much a symptom of this industry is that focus on a genuinely addressable market, not a potentially addressable market, which has always been an issue in terms of raising money. And, pitch decks that you see have kind of assumed things that, are really up in the air. So this more detail that's come out from Germany and which looks likely to actually move ahead is a good sign, and things will develop from there. So if we expand it a bit further beyond Germany, and, we're not going to go through every country, but France, I think, is an interesting one. Will, I know you've been involved in them. You mentioned them previously. So France, I think, if I'm right, has the highest per capita usage of cannabis in Europe. However, a bit like the UK, is probably one of the most conservative in terms of policy on cannabis. So it's a really interesting situation. But Will, I think you've been involved in actually speaking to a lot of people there. Would you mind giving us your view on what's happening in France?
Sure. Well, I think everything is still wet clay at this point in time, but the direction that the government is moving is they're actually doing their diligence now, looking at other countries as examples, with the anticipation that the French government will roll out their own medical program, widespread and with reimbursement, not necessarily exactly a copycat of Germany, but akin to the German medical program. As we all know, France has been working on a pilot project where they've been bringing in, I think it was Aurora that was supplying cannabis, and have been studying sort of a patient base and usage dynamics and trying to understand what the early signals of the market will tell. What's really accelerated the process in France is really looking at how successful they believe Germany will be, and looking at across Europe and just understanding, first of all, from a harm reduction standpoint, there are already French citizens that are traveling across the border to buy cannabis in Germany and come across. So to some degree, the dynamics here are akin a little bit to what happened in the US. So when Massachusetts went, full recreational legal, there were plenty of Connecticut residents, New York residents, Rhode Island residents traveling into Massachusetts and driving across the border with cannabis, sometimes getting into traffic stops and having issues of being in possession of an illegal substance. And those states were loath to continue to arrest or cite their population for going across the border to buy cannabis. And I think probably more importantly, they saw that the tax revenues that were coming off of the legal sales were substantial. So when we're looking at the European theater and we see what appears to be a very healthy German market on the horizon, and people start doing the math around what tax revenues could look like. I mean, today, even looking at the United States, since I guess 96, 97, when cannabis was first legalized in California, the total aggregate tax revenues in the US is $15 billion. Last year, the US tax revenues was $3.8 billion. $1 billion of that was California alone. So when you start thinking about the size of the German market, 80 million people, that's larger than California. Could there be €1 billion of tax revenue there? I think it's actually very likely that there is. And France, as you say, with an illicit population that the French government is spending a tremendous amount of money trying to police. In fact, I think that unfortunately cannabis here in Europe is not unlike the United States, which is, especially in Black and brown communities, it's the number one reason for over-policing of those communities. And that creates a whole host of knock-on negative effect. And so being able to no longer need to apply, I think the UK budget, as an example, is a 20 billion budget to fight illegal drugs in the UK. It's probably a similar size in France. So you can reduce your costs on policing and trafficking. You can put those resources into regulating and taxing legal sales. You can look at a very large tax revenue coming off the cannabis market. And most importantly, while that may be how the reptilian brain of politicians think, which is all about economics and the bottom line, the reality is you're going to have better, safer access for patients. You're going to have better communities that have been traditionally stigmatized or targeted because of cannabis use. And you're effectively, I think that Bill Murray had a great quote, the only dangerous thing about cannabis was actually holding cannabis. It wasn't smoking it, consuming it, or otherwise. And so the harm reduction side, I think, is actually a gigantic economic driver to a lot of the conversations, as well as obviously, the tax and sales. Interestingly enough, France, as a country, I think that the tax revenue base that we talk about in Germany is almost going to be an imputed tax revenue base because you don't tax pharmaceuticals in France. France provides pharma for free. So the question is going to be around cannabis. Will France take the same approach to large-scale pharma? Likely they won't. They won't give a 100% reimbursement, but they'll probably give a substantial stipend to underwrite a large portion of the cost of cannabis. So it may not be a tax revenue base. It may be more of harm reduction and resource allocation into other areas. but it will certainly be an opportunity when you think about the national health spend for situations where they're spending on SSRIs, on other antidepressants, on opioids, and other drugs that have been used in acute situations that have unfortunately long-term harmful effect. The French program will apply cannabis, as we talk about, almost like a widespread, wide-spectrum antibiotic. It's the first line of defense, and it may be able to change the pharma habits of how France is prescribing and using pharma drugs, which again will be a giant cost savings. Yeah. So we're hoping that by the end of this year, we'll have some clarity around what that program looks like. I wouldn't say they're activists, but the almost chambers of commerce on cannabis in France are working hard with the government to erect these policies, and again, data collection and bringing in experts to testify with the members of cabinet. And so I think that France opening up is going to be a very exciting thing. It's not going to be a huge, fast open. It's going to be very slow and steady in pace. But the fact that the change is coming, I think, is really exciting for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And people probably forget that France has a very substantial hemp industry as well. I think one of the top 2 or 3 producers in the world. So you would hope that there is some affinity towards the plant, but that's not always a given. And one of my hopes is that if France are getting on the case, that it kicks the UK up the arse. But that's
we're all hoping the same thing. Look, last week I was invited to speak at Westminster. So I was speaking at the House of Parliament specifically about repealing the Proceeds of Crime Act. And what's interesting is, Jersey, with very few words, amended the Proceeds of Crime Act to allow for legal trade in cannabis in Jersey. And if you just rinse and repeat, you take that same language and you apply it to the Proceeds of Crime Act here for the broader UK, those same positive knock-on effects, the harm reduction element, the resource allocation spend, the tax revenues, because they will be taxed in the UK in a significant way, all of those play very favorably to what politicians need, which in the end means jobs. And I think on the hemp industry side, the industrial hemp projections for what jobs could look like in the UK is something like 220,000 jobs and 2 billion in annual tax revenue. The industry body that has taken data from the United States and extrapolated that to the UK is claiming that there could be upwards of 500,000 jobs. I think the number was even 700,000 jobs, but 500,000 plus jobs and over 5 billion of tax revenue in the UK at maturity. And I think that assumes also sort of a full legal rec program, not just medical. But that is not insignificant in weighing on politicians' minds and, more importantly, weighing on the ballot box. And so I agree with you. The UK has been the absolute laggard here. And, Brexit did not help that status. But given where the UK is spending so much money now on trying to enforce what is almost an unenforceable trafficking situation, and it was really stymieing the growth opportunity that the Proceeds of Crime Act has choked off for the cannabis industry, with very small changes, you all of a sudden unleash this economic opportunity that's so widespread and so strong in the UK that the stigma around it, I think, will fall away very quickly. In fact, I think the stigma's already gone for much of the politicians that we've spoken with. It's really more of just a almost casual stigma, and that's more lack of education. So with education and better programming and better information in real data, people will understand, Bill Murray's great quote, the only dangerous thing about cannabis is possessing cannabis. Hopefully we'll remove that if we can amend the POCA issues, the Proceeds of Crime issues. And then we'll have a very vibrant industry here in the UK as well, because, as you say, France is the highest per capita, but the UK is not far behind. I mean, the embedded illicit market here is very, very strong. And so I think that folks would much rather tax and regulate and drive that market from illegal market to a legal market, rather than spending all the money that they spend right now trying to fight an unwinnable battle.
Yeah, and the politicians and society, they're always a little bit afraid of uncertainty. So, there is a lot of uncertainty. You never know how certain steps will turn out. And hopefully the steps Germany are taking now, it takes out a little bit of this uncertainty. So you will see what is actually going to happen. So you don't have to just look on experiments, or to put it the other way, you have a very big experiment. And hopefully that also helps the other countries to see. And Germany is not always the most innovative company if you look on changes in laws and stuff like that. So it's good that actually the biggest economy in Europe is taking these steps. And I think it will take some time. I think it's not that that it's done then half a year later or something, but over time, it hopefully helps the other countries to take, we want them to take the best decisions, not just a decision. And it doesn't help if you do 3 steps at a time and then it turns out some of them was wrong. And then it's probably worse than taking 1 step at a time. But making big mistakes would actually probably stop the whole process of legalization. It's better to take it step by step.
Yeah. And I think some country of Germany's stature would provide and give and embolden, drug reform in many countries, if it works well, I think, and hopefully it will. We haven't got time to go through the rest of Europe, but there are some interesting, things happening. I really like what's happening in Switzerland, the pilot projects running across there. And I think the Swiss way of doing things means that it would be done in a kind of quite measured way. And hopefully they provide some really good data that gives other people confidence too. And Portugal and Spain as well. There's good progress there. And I would like to go into those, but I'm conscious there's also been some good stuff happening over in the States, or at least some good sounds that are coming out from North America. Will, I'm going to look at you again. Sure. I think it's the Department of Health and Human Services. We're actually quite seriously talking about the idea of rescheduling cannabis in the States from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, I believe. Would you mind adding a bit more color to that debate?
Sure. I'll start with finally we get some seemingly sense coming down the pike. When Joe Biden, June last summer, I guess a year ago last summer, announced changes to his stance on cannabis, and he charged the HHS to begin the process to review rescheduling. He also opened up the federal prisons for those offenders that had nonviolent possession crimes, and they were released. Several thousand prisoners were released from federal penitentiaries. It was the first step of Joe Biden really stepping into a promise that he had made to many of his voters to start looking at the cannabis opportunity as one where we can change the laws and get towards a more accepted and regulated status of cannabis across the U.S. on a federal basis. There was a lot of silence for a long time, and I think that we still see the political football of cannabis, and it is a political football in the U.S., as a very difficult one. And so we had said, Artemis, a long time ago, that we just kind of gave up on the political process. We have seen, the SAFE Act reintroduced, and I'll make a mention about that. But any pure political process where it requires Democrats and Republicans to work together, I love my country, but I'm so frustrated with the polarization around politics in the US. It's like a bunch of 6-year-olds fighting over the last piece of birthday cake. And it's not that you want to have the piece of birthday cake, it's that you don't want the other side to have the piece of birthday cake. And so cannabis on a political process, meaning getting SAFE passed by both the Senate and the House, when the House is controlled by the Republicans and the Senate is still controlled by a thin margin by the Democrats, you could see a world where SAFE gets through the Senate, but it then stalls or just burns out in the House because the Republicans don't want to give a victory to the Democrats. And look, if the Republicans can't even agree with their own speaker about a policy to continue spending and not avoid a government shutdown, or to avoid a government shutdown, if they can't even do that internally within the Republican Party, how do you think they're going to react to something that's going to be seen as a Democratic win? So I would say good luck on SAFE. I'm sorry on the wet blanket there, but I don't think that SAFE's going to get through. That being said, going back to HHS, the process is really interesting under the CSA, the Controlled Substances Act, stipulated, which is what originally put cannabis into a Schedule 1 category. And Schedule 1 means that whatever is classified as Schedule 1 has a high propensity for abuse and has no medical efficacy. Don't worry, the great irony that we all know is that alcohol, which is terrible, highly addictive, and has zero medical benefit, is completely legal. So we'll just step aside that, that was never put under Schedule 1, even though it qualifies. But the hope here is that HHS, which did come out to say that they are reviewing and are going to recommend a rescheduling of cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, which will then be same category as Tylenol 3, which is Tylenol plus codeine. That is a really big change. It doesn't federally allow cannabis from a political side to be sort of, 50 states, fully legal, fully rec everywhere. But what it does provide is the template that if indeed this is codified and we get to a non-narcotic status for cannabis, that we finally have some of the big issues that have been hurting the cannabis industry in the US go away. And that's primarily on the taxation side. 280E, which was established under the RRS code to tax illegal businesses, not just cannabis businesses, but any illegal business at the gross profit line. It basically kills any business that's trying to operate. You can't deduct any of your normal expenses. I think cannabis alone, the statistic was they spent $700 million last year in costs that they would have otherwise saved had cannabis been taxed like any other business on an operating profit line versus a gross profit line. So 280E goes away. The other thing that comes along with rescheduling is theoretically, again, banks aren't being mandated to do this because it's not under the SAFE Act. But if it is now no longer a narcotic product, you can see that banking would come into play. I'm sort of fast forwarding over a lot of very difficult steps that will get to sort of free and open banking, the same way I'm stepping over a lot of very difficult steps that will get to interstate commerce. But you can also see that, you can move codeine, you can move Tylenol 3 across state lines legally. A lot of paperwork overseen by the FDA and overseen by the DEA. But a rescheduling process would allow cannabis potentially to also have interstate commerce. Now, there are a couple of steps along the way that we still have to go through to get to a rescheduled result. HHS makes the recommendation that it should be rescheduled. The DEA then reviews that and comes up with its own assessment of what rescheduling would look like and how it should look. Me, just as a person reading the tea leaves and seeing where this goes, I don't see any fast track to get this done before the end of the year. I don't see this as a process that is totally divested from political play. And in fact, in some ways, I think that the Democrats are going to milk this as much as they can. So the first was the announcement a couple of weeks ago that it's coming. It was a leak. The second is the announcement, yes, we want to reschedule. The third, likely by the end of the year, is the DEA is going to make the recommendation. And my guess would be that, lo and behold, the DEA is going to say, we think it should be rescheduled, but around these framework parameters, and we need to open now the public debate. And then I think that's almost an 8-month process. So say this happens in December, then they open up the public debate process and do the fact gathering and let people weigh in. By August of next year, you can see all the data coming in from the public process, the DEA having sort of a full plan for how rescheduling will look and a recommendation that they want to make to the Attorney General. And obviously HHS standing by their recommendation for this to be Schedule 3. There is a binding element here that whatever HHS determines from a medical standpoint, the medical side of that is binding to the DEA. So it's not like the DEA can claim that they should go back to Schedule 1 because of medical grounds, because that's not their territory. So whatever HHS says, they have to abide by. But they can say how they want to approach rescheduling, what that means for trafficking enforcement, transportation, et cetera. Ultimately, again, lo and behold, we go back to a political process. August, September, October next year, you could see that you get a big stamp on the top of the New York Times saying cannabis now no longer a narcotic right before the elections. So I think there's hope in the US. I'll also just make a comment that even when that headline comes out in the US, maybe it is the New York Times, maybe it's the Post, who knows? The likelihood of this being sort of a free and clear open market is still really murky. There are going to be a lot of steps, state versus federal discourse, and probably discordant discourse, because there's still going to be a lot of things in the federal laws that prevent things that are happening in state laws. But they'll probably pull forward some of the issues that SAFE has brought up, which is like the feds can't really get involved in the state's process. That fits very well with a Republican platform as well, which is the states act and the states get to do what they want under a federal mandate. So it's going to be a bit of a messy process, but you can see the headlines saying that it is going to be rescheduled. You can see a path towards banking and legal access for financial institutions. That means that a wall of money will be coming into cannabis. You will see, unfortunately, probably high speculation over valuations and stocks trading up wildly. But even around these little mini announcements, like we've seen the stocks, Canopy went up 100%. Canadian company went up on the news that it's going to be rescheduled. People are harvesting those profits right now. So you're going to see these mini spikes up and down, up and down, up and down until we get to sort of full legal access. And even then, you're going to see a lot of volatility in the market because it's going to be a testing of the waters for institutions to finally come into the space. But I do think that what had started with Biden's announcement, mid-year last year into the HHS announcements that came out this year, even the resurgence of dialogue around SAFE, those are all sort of positive reading of the tea leaves of what will happen in the future. And I don't think there's any lack of clarity that what's happening in Germany may, in fact, be influencing what's going on in the US. And I'd say that even our discussion at the House of Parliament last week, if we can get something done with POCA here and we start talking about London being a financial center for cannabis, that will also influence what's going on in the US because politics are related to business pretty closely. And when people are seeing that the business torch may be going to another market, I'm not sure that the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ want to lose those financial opportunities. Yeah. So lots of positive forces in play underpinning change, but it's not going to be a straight line. It's still going to be messy.
Yes, lots to unpick there. I don't think there's anywhere more in the world where politics and business are more intrinsically linked than the US. So absolutely. And what's really interesting was the DEA, who have been a historically very unfriendly organization towards cannabis, may have to kind of change their tune. So let's see what comes out of there. We're kind of pushing on for time, and there's still loads I'd like to go through. I mean, one of the areas that I think is probably quite relevant here is the interest from big pharma and big tobacco in this space. And, it's a show in itself. But Daniel, I'm not sure whether have you kind of seen interest from, very big established companies in those spaces looking at cannabis companies yet, or maybe making subtle inquiries? I know, Will, you were at a conference last week that was tobacco involved.
Yes, we have seen interest. So some of the big ones are actually looking on the market. I think they have to, because it's kind of a market which is close to their kind of original market. But in my view, it's a little bit of a hedge. They want to be involved early or some of them want to be involved early in case something happens, that they already have a foot in the door. And so they are following it. In my view, they are following this closely. I don't know if it's always a good thing to have a tobacco company early stage as an investor, because they have strategic interests. It doesn't have to do anything with the cannabis industry. It's in general a question you have to ask yourself as a founder building up a company. What's the right time to take a strategic investor into a company? So a financial investor has a clear goal. He wants to help to create value in the company. And then later, it's the business model to sell the company. And a strategic investor has always a strategic interests. That's kind of comes with the name. So curious what Will's view is, but I think that's in general a question you have to ask yourself. Do you really want to have in the early stage phase, a strategic investor? And I think some of the cannabis companies took it because it was the best valuation they got, or the money they got, and not so much the best money for them at that stage.
Look, I would start with, it's undeniable that whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or pharma, that each of those three categories, and even just broad-based CPG in my world is consumer products. Here it's FMCG. So I think that each of those adjacent industries see cannabis almost as part of their birthright. When you speak to founders of some of the largest alcohol companies, they're like, we've been in the mind-altering business for 120 years. Why wouldn't we take a piece of cannabis? It's also, cannabis is the biggest threat probably to the spirits business, because it really directly competes with spirits, somewhat competes with sort of beer and wine, but it's mainly with the spirits side. And the data is that in every state in the US where cannabis legalized, it was the first time in history that alcohol sales dipped. So, and I also think the demographics now are that as new consumers are coming to the marketplace, those 21-year-olds typically aren't starting with beer and liquor these days. They're actually starting with cannabis. So I think it's a little bit of self-preservation that alcohol needs to be there. I think pharma sees this as terra incognita. The CB1, CB2, sort of the endocannabinoid system in our bodies was really discovered in the 80s. And so it really has been this whole area of potential exploration that has been walled off because of these regressive laws. And yet we saw when GW Pharma sold to Jazz Pharma for $7.2 billion, that there was a justifiable pipeline there. That transaction, even at that eye-popping price, has been an accretive transaction for Jazz. So it was a good transaction. It was good for shareholders, good for the business, because they showed that Epidiolex could be $1 billion drug, and that becomes very, very valuable. So when you start thinking about, okay, that was just CBD for effectively an orphan drug status for Dravet syndrome and childhood epilepsy, when you expand the pharmacopoeia to talk about a drug pipeline that is plant-based, yes, it's difficult to get through EMA or FDA because those institutions aren't set up for anything other than small molecule. But the promise of having pharma drugs that actually have efficacy and have a wide population of patients that they can address becomes an undeniable economic opportunity. So pharma certainly is going to look at this space as well. And as it relates to tobacco, Daniel said, I was at Intertobac last weekend speaking about the cannabis space. tobacco is already in cannabis. So both BAT and PMI have made investments directly in the space. BAT's portfolio is Organigram and Charlotte's Web, Open Book Extracts. And then here in Europe, they invested in Insanity Group, which is one of the wholesalers in Germany. It was a sort of a surprise deal, but PMI announced that an early investment they had made in a company called Psyche, which is also backed by Teva, which is basically a medical device for cannabis vaping, a dosable device for dry flower vaping in Germany, that they're backing that company, they're actually buying that company. They have a 650 million euro purchase price in that business when that business gets the designation that the medical device is approved as a medical device and it has FDA clearance and EMA clearance. So there's still some steps the company has to take before the takeout happens. But the fact that PMI was willing to put down, 650 million on a nascent cannabis company that has basically zero revenues was a pretty big statement that they believe in this space. And I would think that for both boards of BAT and for PMI, their concern is how do we play this space but limit our liability? We don't want to have a tobacco 2.0. I think the greatest worry is that somewhere down the course they're going to find that there are these terrible health knock-on effects of cannabis, and we're back in a tobacco lawsuit. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the data is going to be there, but I think that's kind of the reality that BAT and PMI and the other tobacco companies kind of live with. So staying in a medical space, which I think is what PMI did with the Psyche acquisition, or staying in legal markets where they feel that they're protected, so that's Organigram, or in the CBD market like Charlotte's Web for BAT, that those are kind of safe spaces for them to operate in, to learn the cannabis sector, and then ultimately, look for takeout acquisitions. And I think that, we're not talking about today, tomorrow, or the next day, but 25, 26, 27, when we start seeing Germany opening up and a legal market happening in Europe, and we hopefully will get to a place that we may have federal permissibility in the US, those companies are not going to be quiet. Just as, Jazz Pharma paid a huge eye-popping number for GW Pharma, you can see Curaleaf being a target. You can see GTI being a target. You can see these large cannabis operators being the targets for any one of these industries to move into. I would say primarily it would be the alcohol and tobacco guys to move first, because those are more kind of quasi-consumer plays, and so it fits with their demographic. But for pharma, I would say that they would start spending far more heavily on research and development and working with cannabis companies that are in the formulation and extract areas, looking at new novel products and looking at spending into clinical research that will prove efficacy for drugs down the road. And drugs here don't need to be sort of like the typical small molecule FDA approved patent protected drugs. These can be sort of branded generics. Just think about Sandoz or Teva, multi-billion dollar companies, all based on selling branded generic product. And that's exactly what cannabis is. So for the tobacco companies for the pharma companies to move into the space, it's not really a hard line to think through the intellectual arguments as to why. And it's just more of a matter of having the right legal framework in place for them to move. And that really comes with these changes that are happening that we were speaking at the beginning of the hour, that are happening in Germany, that are happening in Europe, broadly speaking, and that are happening hopefully eventually in the US as well.
Yeah. I'm a little bit dubious about these things, only because pharma and tobacco are kind of probably two of the biggest industrial lobbyists around. So when Daniel talks about strategic, what is the strategy, and could it be potentially obstructive in certain ways? You don't know. And I don't want to go down a conspiracy
There's
hole
plenty
there,
of,
but
plenty of fodder there. I mean, it starts with the question, why haven't the FSA approved for consumption of CBD as a food topic, or the same for the EU? Why has there not been broader CBD laws now that Epidiolex was branded and FDA approved, and the only FDA approved sort of pure plant drug out there? Why haven't you seen more? Well, again, you can let your conspiracy theorists run wild, but there's probably some reality in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are spending money to protect their positions. So yeah, there's machinations going on all around the place. I'm conscious of time though, and we're close to the hour. So I'm going to wrap things up now, because this has been a fascinating discussion. There's loads more we could have talked about, but maybe that's a good cue for us to do this again sometime soon. But I'd like to say thank you to both of you for joining me. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. I hope to get you on the show again.
I love this show. I think you do the best quality, best professional approach to the cannabis conversation in the industry. So I always like appearing on the show. I wish I had your voice, Anuj. It's so smooth, so good. But I really appreciate the content that you provide. And I think that it's always been highly erudite and, top of mind for how to talk about cannabis, how to approach cannabis and do it in a very respectful and thoughtful way. So I appreciate the forum.
Appreciate the words. Thank you, Will. Thanks.
Very
Daniel.
nice words. Very nice words from Will. So I'm even more happy that you invited me as a guest. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. See you soon.
See you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I'm a commercial lawyer and I work with a number of cannabis businesses in the UK. If you need help with commercial contracts, data protection, employment, corporate, or other business legal needs, please do get in touch with me via LinkedIn or at anuj@canvas.global.